Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Salim Ismail. He's an entrepreneur, he's a futurist, he's author of the best-selling book Exponential Organizations, and he's the founder of EXO and OpenEXO. Salim was also founding director of Singularity University, and he's on the board of the X Prize Foundation. Salim has spent over 2 decades helping organizations adapt to rapidly changing technological landscapes. He's worked in more than 50 countries. Salim specializes in AI-driven innovation strategies. So welcome, Salim.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So you've coined this term exponential organization and the EXO. So what is an EXO? What is an exponential organization?
Yeah, the framing of that and the definition came along when I was building Singularity University, and we would have executives come for our 1 week program, and we'd give them a kind of a sense of what was happening in solar energy and AI and so on. And at the end of the week, the universal question was, okay, this is great, I've totally got it, but what the hell do I do on Monday when I get back to the office? And so I developed a thesis around, okay, how do you adapt to this? Your organizations, how do those adapt to this rapidly changing world? And the basic idea of an EXO is that it can you have an org structure that can scale as fast as technology scales.
Mm.
And the metric we use is that you're scaling 10x better, faster, cheaper than your peers in the same space. So that's the rough framing of an EXO.
So scaling 10x faster, better, cheaper than your
Yeah,
competitors.
one or more of those, right? Right. For example, a combustion engine car is about 2,000 moving parts in the drivetrain. A Tesla has 17.
Right.
Right. So in terms of maintenance, design, reliability, it's just like streets ahead of a typical car. And so metrics like that, or Airbnb has maybe 100 times as many listings per employee than Marriott. And so we
Mhm.
look for those types of metrics that give you an indication that you've got an organization that can scale unbelievably quickly. And what we did was we looked at 200 of the fastest growing unicorns 10 years ago and said, okay, how is TED scaling so quickly? How is Uber doing this by not hiring its own staff? Airbnb is tapping into other people's bedrooms. And we teased out a model. We didn't invent anything. We just kind of put a label on what they were doing and put it into a cohesive, prescriptive framework.
And so you're talking about being able to not just scale, but also scale the org structure. It's pretty meta. Okay, so what did you find?
Well, what you find is in typically in companies, you have a product, you try and scale the product, but once you get to scaling the organization, it's painfully linear and incremental. You're hiring a sales guy, then you're hiring a second sales guy, then you're hiring a third sales guy, and it's just not that efficient, and it doesn't scale very well. What we found was by adapting some of these capabilities, you can scale very quickly.
Mm.
And therefore, and it's a bit like hyperscaling, but hyperscaling or blitz scaling, as Reid Hoffman has talked about, but that's very niche. This applies to pretty much any organization. And over the 10 years, we now have evidence that this is how big companies will organize themselves, startups, nonprofits, impact projects, even government departments are starting to use this kind of approach. And we've got incredible data and evidence now that's just better.
Awesome. I want to get to talking about AI at some point here, but I'm getting the brain tease here on the exponential organization stuff. We just got to go in here and see. Okay, so what do you do? So okay, I'm a founder, a CEO, or a leader in an organization. Maybe it's small or medium size, and we've scaled a bit, but we're starting to hit kind of the top of the S curve in our paradigm. We hear this and we say, wow, this sounds real good. So take me from there to how do I get started? What are the basic principles?
So over the decade that we've been doing this, we now have a community of about 40,000 consultants, entrepreneurs, technologists, innovators in 150 countries that we've trained many of them to be coaches to help implement the thing. So we're basically a decentralized McKinsey's almost with this book as the model. And what we do is we pair people up with those coaches to help them. And the first thing we do when we talk to an entrepreneur or business owner is, what is your MTP? What is your massive transformative purpose? What fundamental problem are you trying to solve? We found that all the EXOs we scanned had that in common. Uber is lets everybody have a private driver. Google is organize the world's information. TED is ideas worth spreading, et cetera, et cetera. The next thing we look at is we do an assessment where we look at how do you map onto how much you're using staff on demand or lean startup thinking or OKRs as a team management system, et cetera. And we come up with a gap analysis and say, okay, these are where you're doing really well. These are the ones attributes where you're falling short. We have amazing evidence today that the more the attributes you use, the more successful you'll be, and the
Mm.
more shareholder value you'll create. Can I throw out a quick data point here?
Yeah,
Um,
bring.
when we wrote the book, we scoured and we scanned and we scored the Fortune 100 against this model. How adaptable, flexible, scalable the org structures of the Fortune 100. Okay, and we published an index. I did a segment on Squawk Box, the stock market program, saying here's this index. One of our community members who did a bunch of work for UBS actually tracked for 7 years the top 10 of the Fortune 100 that use these attributes the most, and the bottom 10. So the most flexible, agile on our model versus the least flexible, least agile. And at the end of 7 years, we looked at the results, and it was totally ridiculous. The revenue growth of the top 10 was 3x higher than the bottom 10. Profitability was 6 times higher. Return on equity was 11 times higher, but shareholder returns were 40 times higher.
Wow.
40. That's just in the Fortune 100, right?
Hmm.
We totally should have created an index fund. It would have been the most successful fund like ever. Why? Because as the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt is going to drive market value. And now we can prove that 6 ways to Sunday. And so we guide people in saying which of these attributes should be you be using and adapting and implementing into your organizations. We give them a coach, we set them off. We call it an XO Ready program.
So this is obviously very compelling to me. I mean, to me, adaptability. I mean, I think this is a concept that a lot of people are kind of familiar with, but it's really about going through your whole life and becoming adaptable, adaptable in your relationships, adaptable in your business, adaptable spiritually. I've even got my own little term. I call it becoming an adaptationist, where you actually identify as an adapter and you're picking up technologies from everywhere. And this is very interesting. So if you're going to make an adaptable org structure, how do you do that? What are a couple of tips for that particular
So,
thing?
for example, one of the attributes is autonomy, meaning decentralized decision making as far down the chain as possible, and allow your people, trust your people enough to make choices and decisions because they're at the front line talking to the customer or talking to a vendor or supplier, right? And the more you can do that, the more you can scale naturally because you're not bottlenecked in decision making. That's one
Yes.
example.
Hmm.
Constantly running experiments using lean startup thinking and testing assumptions is number two, is another one. Because as the world becomes more volatile, what you thought was the customer experience is not the customer experience, and it's changing all the time. And you have to be constantly running experiments to keep yourself in track with what's actually happening out there. And
Hmm.
like Jeff Bezos famously said, the success of Amazon is a function of how many experiments we run, and so
Yeah.
that kind of, so we have a set of characteristics, five on the external side, like leveraging other people's assets or staff, using community or crowd to scale like XPRIZE does. TED uses its community to run TEDx events and scales very rapidly, etc. And then five internal mechanisms like OKRs to track the company performance and team performance, lean startup thinking, decentralized decision making, and decentralized reporting lines as much as possible, leading all the way to DAOs if you're in the Web3 world, etc. And so we have a set of characteristics that are 10 that reflect. We organize it like a brain: five on the right hand side to drive growth, five on the left hand side to manage the control framework, and the MTP, the massive transformative purpose, at the top that gives the kind of spiritual lens on what are you trying to achieve as an organization. And
Hmm.
that gives a great, if you're in a hyper growth cycle, you want that singular focus that everybody in the organization understands what we're trying to do. Right. And we
Yeah.
found this model is now incredibly powerful across the board. It's kind of a meta model of what's going on out there anyway. But now we found that more and more organizations are using it. We call this the decade of the EXO, and we're pretty clear that over the next 10 years, whether they call it that or not, the people that are using these characteristics will be much, much more successful.
Awesome. Well, we're actually here to talk about AI, but we had to do it. So everyone, that's a teaser. Go read Exponential Organizations. We'll put some links here and
Sure. Every week we do a discovery call and people can just time to listen to it and then get more involved if they feel like it.
okay. And Salim's a business growth gangster, so go check it out. Now, let's talk a little bit about AI because, that's what we're really here to chat about. I've just been having conversations with really diverse people from all around kind of like industries, niches, kind of genres, just finding out what's going on because it's so, it's so transformative. So AI, generative AI, right? Generative artificial intelligence. And just in the minute or two that we were chatting before this, I realized you like definitions and so do I. And so what is AI? What is intelligence? What is generative? What are we talking about here?
So, we've gone through a series of phases of AI. Narrow AI is what the vast majority of AI has been. Anti-lock braking systems, fuzzy logic in your cameras, credit card fraud detection systems, very singular purpose machine learning where you train it on a batch and then it can find signals from noise. Then we move to deep learning where a system can learn on its own as it's encountering new data. Right. And then you get to Gen AI, where you've created large language models that use that attention paper to kind of guide where things go and prescriptively predict what's going to happen next, or writing text and so on for you, or generating images for you. I remember talking to Jeffrey Hinton a few years ago in Toronto and asked him he said deep learning is reaching the end of its limitations. And I said, what's next? He goes, I don't know, but we need the next breakthrough. And literally 3 months later, the Transformer paper was written at Google that changed everything and unleashed this Gen AI stuff. What I find fascinating is when you talk to the founders of these systems, whether it's Sam Altman or Iman Mustaq at Stability AI or whatever, they're blown away by how good these are. Like they can't believe the results, and you're like, wow, that's really quite incredible. I think, and I think we're at a point where we're going to have radical shift in how we do things, but I don't look at it as a artificial intelligence. I think of it as augmented intelligence. I think it just complements human capability and human activity radically. And for me, it's like going from typewriter to word processor, or
Mhm.
calculator to spreadsheet. It just uplifts everything.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes when I'm doing demos and so forth, I've got they're right here, but right, I've got my little telegraph, and then I've got my my old phone, and then I got my Dynatac 8000, and I got a Motorola flip phone, and and just to kind of show this stuff because exactly most people just have not wrapped their head around even how fast that was moving and this, right? And I really appreciate the augmented versus artificial, because I think it's so unfortunate that it's called artificial intelligence. It makes it sound fake.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And we have a big problem also around the definition of intelligence, right? So people go on about how AIs will be smarter than human beings. And I'm like, whoa, Nelly, hold on a second. What do you mean by smarter? Because there's about a dozen facets of intelligence. The IQ test measures two of them: the speed of thought processing, the ability to match concepts across frameworks. But it does measure emotional intelligence or visual intelligence or linguistic intelligence or the spiritual concept of presence or awareness. It does measure any of that. As a leader, you're bringing a lot of that to bear when you make business choices and business decisions or personal decisions. And so you're leaving out huge amounts of stuff when you say an AI will be smarter, right? So I get really annoyed with that, and I get on a soapbox and I go on a rant and I go, for God's sake, stop talking about this until you very clearly define it. And then we can have a more nuanced discussion about this. When you blindly say that, because what happens is it triggers the amygdala and people go, oh my God, AI is going to get smarter than people. And then you end up with a Hollywood view of Terminator, Skynet, The Matrix, the robot overlords come and take over the world. And pretty much it always ends up as if we're lucky, we're pets, and if we're unlucky, we're food, you know? But when you see the way AI is evolving, take PageRank, Google's AI to scan the web of the world, it's developing a completely orthogonal complementary intelligence to human intelligence. It's not replicative at all. And so I look at it as augmented intelligence, not artificial.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, no, well, I mean, rant all you want, because I mean, well, something's going on right now. We're doing this interview at the basically the end of 2024, coming into 2025, and something's happening right now, and I'm sure you're experiencing it too. Like when you go and you use Claude or use, Gemini, or you use, ChatGPT or O1 or any of these models that are coming out, it's just there's something about it that if you can hold it as being like as highly intelligent as you can imagine, it will meet you there. And yes, it's not perfect, and yes, it has all these things, but it does things that are just so. I mean, it would be like having a building with 100 researchers and writers in it. To for like a month to turn out something that it can make real time. And so as we're here, like in some ways I've done back of the envelope math on this, and generative AI is about 1,000,000x normal human intelligence in certain places right now. And that's kind of my math. And I could explain that and so forth, but it's not, um, it's not doing some things like you're saying, but the fact that it's getting better, the fact that it's getting, 10xing and, this. So what happens over the coming years right now to it? And then how do we kind of dance with it and collaborate with it and integrate?
So I'm incredibly excited about three or four major areas of where Gen AI could go and AI overall. One
Mhm.
is education and the way it could completely transform education. If I have an AI watching me as I'm learning some subject, it can watch and navigate, help me navigate. It can see my learning style. It can map, customize, and personalize that education and training for exactly my pace, my learning style, etc. So that's just a
Yes.
huge game changer. The second is healthcare, where it's going to just radically change how we look at things and the ability to do diagnostics and then recommend things. Because we make, when you go to the doctor today, you get the wrong diagnosis about 30% of the time. Yeah, that's just
Wow.
terrible. Yeah, that's just terrible.
Wow.
Now you complement that with an AI, and this is a game changer. Today, if you're a cancer doctor, for example, we have 2,000 cancer research papers published every day. You can't read 2,000 papers. You need an AI to scan them all and then look at your patients, say, hey, for these three patients, these papers are the most relevant, right?
Yeah.
So this is where the complementary aspect becomes incredibly important. The third area, I have a degree in theoretical physics, and the ability for AI to do deep science is something that's just got me jellied up with excitement. I mean, it's just so amazing what we're going to be able to do. Maybe solve the grand unification theory problems and solve quantum mechanics, et cetera, in ways that we can't even begin to understand right now. And a fourth area where I get really excited is government policy. Okay. So today, if you're like, say, the head of the Treasury, and you're like, okay, or the head of the Fed, and you're like, okay, we need to drop inflation by 1%. You're totally guessing as to what you've got a certain set of knobs and levers. And AI scanning all the data in the economy and looking at all the transactions in real time is going to go, oh, just do these two things, and have a much better outcome than a
Mhm.
human being could possibly have. And so I think those are some of the areas where I'm incredibly excited about it.
Yeah, amazing. Well, the 30% wrong diagnosis, I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I try to stay away from doctors as much as possible, and now I understand intuitively why.
Yeah, and for the poor doctor, right? You get trained up in something. You spend 7 years getting trained up in something, and then you're essentially, if you, like, for example, one of the things we found at Singularity is that if you're doing a master's in neuroscience today, by the
Mhm.
time you finish your master's degree, you're out of date
Right.
because the field is changing faster than our ability to teach it. So that's a structural problem. And as healthcare is evolving quickly, the doctor's out of date by the time they've graduated.
Hmm. Hmm. So if you're an individual right now, because there's something very exciting. I mean, I use generative AI every day. Every time I use it, pretty much every time I use it, I have to stop and just it makes me change what I think is possible in reality, and I have to kind of like I don't know, recontextualize everything I know. Um, how do we? I feel like to start with, we should just all be using it every day, just so that we at least understand it.
What I'm loving about it, it forces us to ponder the questions we're asking more deeply,
Hmm.
right? That whole idea of prompt engineering, because the sophistication of the prompt yields the outcome. And
Yes.
so we're going to be we have to be very present as to what questions we're asking, and then you can get incredible outcomes out the back end.
Yeah. But there's so much. Let's say like opportunity slash uncertainty that it brings. Like last week, I was listening to a philosophy lecture, and it was excellent. It's on Jordan Peterson's Peterson Academy, and I was listening to some modern philosophy stuff, and I heard one kind of presentation. I was like, this is beautiful. Like this is just so well presented, but it was about one philosopher, And I was thinking, yeah, it would be nice if I could have this on any, philosopher. And then I remembered, oh yeah, I have generative AI. And so I took the transcript, I went over to Claude. I said, here's a philosophy talk that here's a transcript of a presentation, and it was on Descartes. And I was like, can you write me a prompt so that I could have a presentation like this on any. So it wrote me a prompt, and it was long. I mean, it was like 5 pages with like all this detailed shit that I would have never thought of. And then I took the prompt and I tweaked it up a little bit. And then I went over to Chat GPT and I dropped it in, and then it, pulled up one. And then I went on my phone and I said, read aloud to me. And, 10 minutes later, it wasn't, I've had to tweak it a few times, but like to be able to do that. And then now you know what I'm saying? It's just such a paradigm shift.
It is a massive paradigm shift, and just there's a few areas where, as we kind of let this loose, it's going to completely change the game. Software development is one of those areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it just write the software for you. We spend a lot of time, if you're building a software system today, we're wondering and being careful about how you maintain that software system. And now we can just ignore that entire maintenance side and say the AI will handle that side totally. And so there's unbelievable potential and opportunity coming. I think this is such a huge uplifter for humanity overall. I love it.
I remember years ago, this is probably like 10 or 15 years ago, when GPUs started to become the thing. Like they just started to be around more and more processing started going to them. And I remember reading that they're being used more and more for AI because AI is a different kind of processing, and the GPU isn't as precise, but it's a lot faster. And so that it makes mistakes. So there's like more noise in there, but it's so much faster that it doesn't matter. And so when, ChatGPT and so forth came out, and, we started seeing all these hallucinations and inaccuracies, and it's kind of like sometimes it's like talking to a dream human in a way. I, I had this model in my mind, and I thought to myself, because people, one of the first things, I'm sure you've seen this too, when you show it to somebody who hasn't seen it before, they'll read something and it'll go, well, that's not right. And it'll like do this miraculous thing, and there'll be one mistake, and then someone will go, well, it's not right there, and I'm like, well, but
My
did you see, go ahead.
my favorite ever prompt was take Bible Genesis chapter 1 and rewrite it as a rap song. And it's just awesome to see what this thing puts out. It's incredible. And you're like, how the hell did it do that? That would have taken people hours and hours and hours to do. And this thing just went boom, here you go.
Exactly. And so for me, when I see mistakes, hallucinations, inaccuracies, a little too much wokeness in there, whatever the stuff is that everyone's complaining about, I kind of look at it, and I almost look at it as like a mistake my daughter would make when she's, writing, and I go, that's cute.
I think that's exactly the right way of looking at it. The human brain is not prescriptive in that, it's not deterministic in that same way. Every time
Mm,
somebody asks you a question, you're answering it in a slightly different way, right? As we
right.
train AI and all the things we've done, we should absolutely expect it to mimic that, because you have this what we call a garbage in, garbage out problem on these training models.
Yes.
Trained on all the data, and this is where we get lots of biases that build in and errors because of the data we're feeding it, et cetera, et cetera. I came across a crazy one, which is in the 50s they did all these experiments, and they worked out that if you stress a human being, the response is a fight or flight response, right?
Hmm.
And then about 10 years ago, somebody looked at the data and realized all the participants in those studies were men.
Mm,
So they went, well, how do women respond? So they went through reran those same studies with women, and it turns out women do not have a fight or flight response. Women have a response called tend and befriend. They huddle up and nurture each other. And
hmm.
it's such a complete, now if you fed that into an AI, you're going to get the wrong answer in terms of how human beings respond, just because the data was flawed. Right? And I think we have the opportunity now to go back and look at these things and retrain things, rerun some of these old experiments, and come up with much better data that covers the whole, much more broadly, the human experience. And then, of course, the outcome will be much better.
Mm. So let's say that you're a knowledge worker in, today's economy, and you're, forward thinking, but you can see, as most knowledge workers can right now, that change is coming, that their entire industry might be transformed in some way. Where's the opportunity for us? Like, where should we be focusing? How should we be thinking about it? What should we be expecting over the next 3, 5, 10 years?
I think if you look at it from, there's a couple of ways of looking at it, right? You could put on a kind of your amygdala response and go, "Oh my God, it's going to take all the jobs. This is a disaster. We should shut it down." That would be that
Mm.
response with that mindset. If you put on an optimistic mindset, then it uplifts people, and you go, "Wait, instead of typing things out on a piece of paper and a typewriter, I now have a word processor and I can delete and everything's soft coded. That's amazing." Right. And I think that's where it'll be really powerful. I think what the framing I've heard best is generative AI applied to white collar work will get rid of a huge amount of what you would call white collar drudgery. Okay.
Mm.
So let's say I'm a booking agent for a family resort in the Caribbean, right? And a family calls up and goes, "We've got three families wanting to book rooms. The kids want to have interconnecting rooms, and we want to be close to the pool." And you could spend like hours figuring out, okay, what's the permutation of what rooms are available, the size of the rooms, are they connected, da 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 da, go back and forth a bunch of times. And the AI is going to go, here, have these rooms, right? And you're done. And so I think that's where it's going to have a massive impact on that aspect. And it's going to make my life much easier because I can now deal with the customer rather than dealing with this hours of like permutations that are not that trivial to try and hack through. And now I uplift because now I can spend much more time with the human element of the customer. And so I think that's where it's going to have a huge impact in all sorts of areas. Well, take accounting. Instead of doing the basic accounting stuff, you'll basically, as an accountant, you'll focus much more on the policy side, and the AI will figure out all the number crunching.
And so it's more, I mean, because I reflect a lot on, what is it not? And what I keep coming back to is it is not human. And so there's something special about interacting with a human. We just had an event over the last few days, and being in 3D with real people, that's never going to be like, there's a trust that we have,
Well,
for, go ahead.
there's so much communication that happens in face to face. We have pheromones flying around, we have body language, we operate in groups in ways, and we socially connect ourselves to various ways of operating and being. You see people in a conference that are kind of rotating amongst each other in a particular format where they're kind of used to that. So those are all nuances of being in the face-to-face style because we're so biologically geared for that, the social aspect of being human. I remember when video conferencing first popped up, people are like, well, this will be the end of the conferencing thing because if I can get all the content from a video feed, why do I need to go to the conference, right? So we had video conferencing emerge to the extent of stuff like Zoom totally taking over. But more people are going to conferences than ever before because of that human connection. And I think that's where it's going to take a long time for AI to kind of catch up because there's just so much nonverbal communication and sensory perception that happens, body language, as I mentioned, pheromones, etc., that we really value that aspect of it profoundly. And I think it'll be a long time before anything comes close to replicating that experience.
So your massive transformative purpose is asking the question, how do you transform civilization? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is civilization and what is transform? And then how do you do it?
So transform is the idea that we're going through the biggest inflection point in the history of mankind. Right?
Yeah.
In the 15th century, the printing press changed everything. And we call that a Gutenberg moment because it fundamentally transformed society. Well, solar energy fundamentally transforms society. Blockchains totally change. AI totally changes the world. We have about 20 of those hitting us at the same time. We've never seen this much technological innovation hitting us at the same time in the history of mankind. So that's a huge challenge. This is why we're seeing so much stress in the world, is that there's
Yeah.
forcing function of technology that's changing everything. And I think companies are pretty good at adapting. You have creative destruction. If you don't meet your numbers, you go out of business. Great. I think we have a good spectrum of transforming an individual from martial arts and yoga to NLP to cognitive behavior therapy, all the way to psychedelics, right? But the organizations and our institutions are where we're very weak. So if you try anything disruptive in a big company, the immune system attacks you because all of our organizations are built to resist change and withstand risk, right? And they're
Mm.
built for markets that don't change very often, and they have time to formulate a strategy and try and go win that market, da 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 da. And none of that applies anymore. So
Mhm.
that's on the large corporate side. And then it's even worse on the institution side, because God help you if you try and update teachers, the academia, the teachers go bananas. You try and update religion and they'll go really crazy. You try and update healthcare and the doctors fight back. And so we've got embedded immune systems in journalism, in education, in healthcare, etc. And that, I think, is the weakest part. We don't have tools for updating those models. There's no feedback loop in the UN, for example, to update the UN Security Council. And yet, you've got Russia doing really nasty stuff and it's sitting on the Security Council. There's no mechanism for kicking it off because we just didn't build that in. And so there's no feedback loop in many of our institutions. And that I think is the weakest point around this. I did a TEDx talk about this. And my 90-year-old dad, right, came to a session that I did. And he puts up his hand and he goes, "Can I heckle?" I'm like, "Yeah, of course you can." He said, "I totally disagree with your moniker of fixing civilization." I'm like, "Really? You don't think we need to fix things?" He's like, "Yeah, of course we do. The problem is not that. Is the civilization part I have an issue with." He goes, "We've not civilized the world. We've materialized the world. We still have to do the work that we're apes with tools running around in tribal paradigms, beating each other to death. Middle East is an obvious example today, right? We still need to do the work to actually civilize the world." And I was like, wow, wisdom bomb from the elders, boom. And I think that's the area where we really need to. And this is where I think the AI stuff could really help, because it could say, "Hey, like, just do it this way and stop fighting over this." And here's what I'm hoping is, as we get to say energy abundance, then the need to fight wars drops drastically.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we have the
Yeah.
real opportunity. So I think there's two paths for humanity as we go down this futures. We have a Star Trek path and we have a Mad Max path. And I used to think we're going to go down one or the other, but that's clearly both are happening at the same time. Silicon Valley or Singapore or Berlin is very much, or Austin is very much Star Trek. You have an amazing lifestyle at a very low cost, etc. And then you go to Ukraine or Gaza or, that's totally Mad Max, right? And
Yeah.
so we're having both occur in extremes around the world everywhere today.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember reading somewhere in some psychology book the idea that um, is as individuals, humans are very resilient, but relationships are very sensitive and not
Very, and
very
his
resilient.
groups were a nightmare.
Exactly. And so, and also there's this, I mean, I realized years ago that once I can get stuff loaded up into my brain, I can process it. It's kind of like in a computer, right? The input and output is the hard part. It's like to get it loaded up in the first place. And then once I have, once you have a big insight, to get it back out through words or diagrams or pictures is very challenging. And so when you're thinking about an organization, to adapt, everyone in the organization, I'm in theory, needs to be updating their models together in a way. Is that right?
A lot of it has to do with like the muscular skeletal fabric of the organization. For example, the KPI structure, how you reward behavior will result in different behavior, right? And
Yep.
so therefore you can create reward structures and bonus structures around this. I'll tell you one of my favorite impacts that I've ever had was I did a session with the board of Philip Morris, the cigarette company. Right. I kind of yelled at them, but said, "You're MTP. I mean, you're selling cigarettes, right? You really need whatever." This was in about 2015. 4 years later, the head of innovation calls me up and goes, "Go check out our website. We've had a deep rethink as a company, as employees, as shareholders, as stakeholders." And I go look at their website. It literally says a smoke-free world. Right? I'm like, "Wait, what?
Whoa.
Like what? This is like a parody, right?" I'm like, "You're
Whoa.
kidding." He's like, "Nope. We basically are great at delivering molecules into lungs. So what if we delivered wellness?" And now all of bonus structures of the executives are on non-smoke products. They
Hmm.
they get no executive bonuses for the smoke products. And I was like, "That's amazing
Hmm.
that you can end up that way." So in the structure of the organization, how departments are formed, etc., you get a lot of this cruft of traditional 20th century structures that hold back the flexibility and agility that you need. I came across this because before Singularity, I was the head of innovation at Yahoo. Okay. I was running their incubator. And I came across a terrible problem, which was the more disruptive a product we came up with, the less the company could handle it.
Mm,
I was like,
mhm,
wait, you hired me to disrupt this stuff. We bring it to you and you can't cope. Like, why is this happening? You're a Silicon Valley company. You're not a bank or a telco. So what is going on here? And I kind of identified this term, identified to me by Jeff Kowalski, who was the CTO of Autodesk. He goes, oh, that's the immune system problem. I was like, ding, every big organization has this immune system problem where you attack new ideas. And the institutions are even worse, right? And so
mhm,
we've been spending a lot of time over the last decade solving that problem. And so when I think about how do you transform civilization, if we can't solve that immune system problem, we can't bring new ideas into the world. We
mhm.
have bankers fighting Bitcoin, we've got taxis fighting Uber, and we're just not progressing the world quickly enough to take advantage of the amazing technologies that are coming.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people live in I mean, depending on what lens or prism you want to use, whether it's fixed mindset or whether it's developmental, paradigms and so forth. A lot of people live in worlds that are more that they see as more fixed and secure, and the idea of change and progress, it's not just traditionalist and progressive. There's a
No, no,
whole
no,
other
it's
level
not.
we're dealing with.
It's
Yeah.
actually way deeper than this. And Peter
Yes.
identified this in the book Abundance, where they talked about the amygdala, right?
Hmm.
So we all have this little organ in the back of our brain that we evolved when we were running around the plains of Africa. Back then, if you heard a noise in the bushes, you ran because bad news could kill you.
Hmm.
Good news doesn't kill you. If I missed a piece of good news, I must miss some fruit that I could eat. If I missed a piece of bad news, I died. And so our brains are 10 times more likely to pay attention to bad news than good news because of that old survival factor. This is why Fox News does very well. If you watch Fox
Hmm.
News, you're going to die this week, right? If you're lucky until next week, you're going to die next week. Peter, I love Peter. He calls CNN the crisis news network because
Yeah.
when you can track every bank robbery in high definition, real time, streamed to 20 devices, you think the world is going to hell. And so we have to kind of combat that amygdala with, because the actual likelihood of us dying from a kind of an animal or whatever is thousands of times less than a few hundred years ago.
Hmm.
And yet that dominates our biology. And so we have to get us, and this is important because when you come across something new, like an autonomous car, the first reaction is the amygdala response. It goes, oh my God, autonomous car, that car might kill somebody. Let's ban the car until we understand how it's going to be regulated, right?
Hmm.
And because why people don't want to be killed by robots, they'd much rather be killed by drunk people, which is what's happening today. So you have to overcome that thing, whether it's CRISPR or Bitcoin or drones or autonomous cars. We have this huge response mechanism that we have to overcome where we relate to new things as dangerous, and then all of our flags go off. And I think
Hmm.
that's the biggest problem we have with humanity. And then you bring that into the group structure and legal frameworks. And when the first thing that happens when we have a new technology like drones is people go, oh my God, somebody might load up a drone with C4 and fly it in the White House, ban drones. And then it takes like 20 years to unlock the value of that when the bad guy's never going to listen to the regulation anyway. So all you do is kill off the good innovation. So it's really frustrating watching people freak out about things. And really, it's never as big of a problem as we thought.
So a lot of this comes down, I would say, to culture, because right, cultural transformation or change is notoriously challenging. How can we use AI to help with this?
I think you have to, there's one path for operating as a human being into the future, and you have to be an erudite, evidentiary free thinker. What I mean by that is erudite means you have to be able to present clearly your ideas. Evidentiary means you have to be able to follow the data. And free thinker means you can't be trapped by paradigms of old models. Like, for example, if I say I'm a Buddhist scholar, for me, that's like an oxymoron because the fact that you're a Buddhist constrains your free ability to do free thinking right there, or Christian scholar, or whatever frame you want to use. So you have to be free thinking and evidentiary. And I think once you can operate from that mindset and from those heuristics, then AI becomes a massive tool and enabler for all sorts of things, can bring you data, can bring you conclusions, and you can operate very powerfully as an individual and then operate in groups that way. right? So we've actually created tool sets for solving this immune system problem, by the way. So we piloted it with Procter & Gamble, and we found a 10-week engagement that we ran now inside big corporations that hacks culture at scale. And we've done it like 60 times with Black & Decker, HP, Visa around the world. And so we've solved it there. We have a nonprofit that does the same thing in public sector because there you need to change policy. And so it takes 16 weeks, but it works. We've done it a bunch of times. And now we're thinking about, okay, how would you run this culture hacking framework into institutions and policy making, et cetera? And we're going after that next, because that's where I see is the tip of the spear. If you can solve the resistance to cultural change, as you mentioned,
Yep.
then lots of things become possible. And if a great way of putting this is what Tony Robbins or Landmark Education, where they use NLP to change the state of an individual. We kind of have learned how to do that at an organizational level. We change the subconscious state of an organization.
We've only got a few minutes. Give me a tidbit, 30 seconds. One little something that you do in there that that folks could use.
What we'll do is we'll do an opening workshop with the existing leadership and freak them out. And
Uh-huh.
then we leave them alone because they're useless for the future anyway. And then we take the 25 young leaders in that organization, the future lieutenants, and they actually do the work. So we mentor them. And what we found is when they come back with new ideas, the old guys don't fight them in the same way. And then the
Beautiful.
process becomes right. And when those 25 young people go back to their day jobs without realizing it, they infect everybody else with their way of being. And now you start a viral meme that starts spreading through the organization. And after doing it like
Beautiful.
60 times, they're pretty good at it.
All right, one last question. Does generative AI or whatever kind of AI is coming, does it ever wake up? Does it become sentient? Does it become self-aware, self-improving, self-motivated, and then what?
So this is a very big question. I have one vector of an answer to this, right? Now I have to give a caveat here because we still end up with the same problem. We don't know what consciousness is. We don't have a definition for it. We don't have a test for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
A subset of consciousness is self-awareness. And you look like you're self-aware, so I attribute self-awareness to you, right? I feel like I'm self-aware, but my wife disagrees. And so you have a huge language problem in dealing with something like consciousness. The best kind of framing I've seen from this comes from Hod Lipson, who's a professor at Columbia, who's teaching robots to self-assemble with a recursive pattern. And he's building evolutionary robots, really amazing work. He's come up with a very clear model for how to generate self-awareness in an AI, which is ask an AI, how do you perceive yourself 5 years in the future? And when you ask that question, it creates a feedback loop where the AI is now thinking, well, what am I now? To then perceive what I might be in the future. And you generate a feedback loop where at some point it'll generate self-awareness and maybe consciousness at some point if you do that. Now, if you go to ChatGPT or Gemini and ask this question, it's been blocked.
Mm.
And I think when, remember that episode a couple of years ago where Facebook freaked out because they thought they may have created a conscious AI?
Mm-hmm.
We think that's what happened. Somebody asked that question. How do you perceive yourself in the future? Human beings have a unique ability to perceive ourselves in the future, right? A
Mm-hmm.
mosquito does not have that ability. And so that vector of self-perception in a future time state may be the way. Now, of course, somebody's going to take an open source AI model and start asking it those questions and then seeing what happens. And you could actually end up with a conscious or self-awareness AI of some type. I remember once asking one of our robot experts at Singularity, is there a system in the world that has the requisite processing power, inputs and outputs that it might generate self-awareness, right? And he's like, let me think about that. And he came back to me 2 days later and he goes, I think I have an answer for you. I'm like, okay. He goes, traffic systems. In his opinion, traffic systems have the feedback loops and processing power and inputs and outputs and sensors where one day it might suddenly go, oh, I'm a traffic system, right? And it was just totally mind-boggling. Two
Fascinating.
questions come up when you think about that. One is, what would it do? And how would we know? And the
Yeah.
problem is, if some AI generated self-awareness, we wouldn't know.
Yeah.
We have no test for this. So this is a huge, huge gray area. I'm fascinated to see what happens because we're probably going to evolve new life forms of this. I think Star Trek with the Android data dealt with this the best. They really handled and treated that whole paradigm of self-awareness and generative consciousness as a paradigm in that series. So I think we'll end up with stuff like that coming on. It's fascinating to think about.
Salim, thank you so much. Everyone, go read Exponential Organizations. Go check out his stuff. We'll put some links down below to his work if you want to go follow up. Thank you for coming, Salim.
No, it's been great, great, great conversation.